Welcome to the Pursuit of Learning podcast. I'm your host, Clint Murphy. My goal is for each of us to grow personally, professionally, and financially, one conversation at a time. To do that, we will have conversations with subject matter experts across a variety of modalities. My job as your host will be to dig out those golden nuggets of wisdom that will facilitate our growth. Join me on this pursuit. Today, we welcome our first two-time guest to the Pursuit of Learning podcast, Brian Sachetta. Last time Brian was here, we talked about getting out of your head and overcoming anxiety. Today, we do the same for depression. Tips, tricks, tools, and strategies. Depression is something I've been dealing with myself for the last 17 years, and I know that during COVID, isolation led to amplification. So the more people we can have this conversation with and share this information with, the better. Enjoy our talk. Brian, welcome back to the Pursuit of Learning podcast. You are our first repeat guest on the podcast, so excited to have you here. And a new question I think we've introduced since you were here last. What is motivating you in life right now? And what are 2 or 3 things you want to get across to the listeners in our conversation today?
Definitely. Yeah. Clint, thanks for having me back. It's an honor to be a repeat guest. We had a great conversation last time, so looking to replicate that. In terms of answering your question, I would say what is motivating me in life right now? I think there's a few different things, and I'm not going to jump into all of them, but one of them, which will be the topic of this conversation, is trying to help people in their mental health battles. And so that was the reason behind the second book I published, which we'll talk about today, as well as the first one and all my other efforts in the space. But that is what continues to drive me forward. Talking to different people, getting messages from folks who read my content and said that it helped them in some capacity. That is what I do this for. And then, just a fun one in terms of, what else motivates me. I think I kind of look at my life in general as I kind of come to the table with a sort of investment philosophy, right? And it's rather than saying, this is exactly how my life is going to go, I say, look, I'm open to all these different ideas and avenues. And so I'm going to kind of create a bunch of different buckets and put time and effort and resources into each one and then see where they all go, right? And then, maybe a year later or something like that, I started a project on the side and, didn't think it would turn into anything, but maybe it does. So that's kind of my philosophy, and also what's motivating me right now is just trying to set myself up for a better future, and also through all the different things that I do, try to make an impact on the world and those around me. So I think that answers the first part of your question. The second part of your question, I don't even remember what it was.
So what are 2 or 3 things that you want to make sure we cover today that you want to get across to our listeners?
I think this conversation will be heavily focused on the subject of depression. So I think a couple things there would be, letting folks know exactly what that is, that beast, and then also giving them some strategies for coping with it and managing it, and then leaving them also with a message of solidarity and hope, knowing that, things can get better. They often do get better, and, every situation is a little bit different, but you take enough of the strategies that we talk about and put them in your own toolkit and apply them long enough, and hopefully, the proverbial sun will poke out through the cloud soon enough.
It's such a great way to say it. And I remember when we were talking the first time and we were talking about anxiety and we were talking about how that feels. And we started talking about depression and the abyss and how that feels like a whirlpool down versus a tornado up. And then to read the book, it was beautiful to see and to dive into. And so what we're talking about here is get out of your head. Volume 2, Navigating the Abyss of Depression. So a couple spots I'd love to start on this. The first one is you mentioned definitions right there. And so for the people that are listening, I thought you had a very simple definition of depression. And then I thought after we covered that, we can talk about the concept again of a state machine. Because a lot of what we're going to talk about today is what state are we in when we're in depression, and what are those things that we can do to change that state. So getting people familiar with what the state machine is and what your definition of depression is, I think will definitely help.
Cool. Yeah, so let's jump into the definition of depression. I do want to preface by saying that I am not a mental health clinician. I am not a physician, anything like that. I'm just a dude who's been through some of the same things that many folks listening will have been through. So what I like to do is, in my writing, I like to simplify things, right? It's possible you could go into the DSM-5 or WebMD or something like that and find differing definitions than the ones we're going to talk about here. But in my writing, the whole point is like, how do we simplify things in a way that's manageable for folks? And then how can folks then take those definitions, or how can we create definitions that folks can then take and apply in their lives in a simple fashion, right? If we are so caught up in what the definition is, then I think we've kind of lost sight of things. So I guess in consideration of that, why don't we go ahead and define depression, or present a simplified definition to listeners? So I say in this second book that depression, it's a word that can refer to a bunch of different things. So one of them could be like a clinical mood disorder, right? So you might have postpartum depression, you might have major depressive disorder, you might have bipolar disorder, something like that. It could also refer to a dark mental state, right? Somebody may have just lost their job, or they may have had a difficult conversation with a boss or something where they were let down, and maybe they don't express all the symptoms or enough of the symptoms for a doctor to say like, hey, you're suffering through major depressive disorder right now. But in their mind, right, they are in a pushed down state, which we can refer to as depression. And obviously we want to be careful as to what we say is depression and what is not, right? Because sometimes when we hold on to things or attach ourselves to different words, we can then kind of get stuck in them for longer, right? So sometimes we may be having a bad day. And I think to say like, hey, I am acknowledging the fact that today is not going necessarily the way that I want it to, rather than blowing it maybe out of proportion and saying like, I am depressed right now because I'm having a bad day. Sometimes it's sort of like the process of meditation, where rather than attaching to our thoughts and saying like, I got to analyze them, I got to see how they make me feel and whatnot, we can just let them sort of float on by without growing emotionally attached to them. So I think it's important to make a bunch of distinctions like that. I think also from that standpoint, it's a little bit clearer for listeners to be able to say like, okay, yes, I am in that sort of mental state right now, or my doctor has, diagnosed me with something like that. I think when we get into the minutia of like, hey, you have to exhibit, you have to have these 5 different things going on for this much time or whatever. It's like, sure, there needs to be some sort of guideline or protocol for doctors to be able to diagnose things. But at the same time, like if a listener is like, hey, I just don't feel well, I really haven't felt well in a long time, like that person knows how they feel, right? And I think it's from that standpoint or that starting point, that person can then go say like, I need to know how to get past this. I need to know what I should be doing to make progress in my life. So I think that's a good starting point for the conversation overall. And then again, you had asked a second question. So just kindly remind me of what that one was.
Yeah. So, well, let's stay on this one for a while and then we'll get back to the second one, because part of what I'm hearing there is also not just recognizing when we're depressed. And I think 2 key words I'll zone in on that you wrote about that we'll talk about, I know, throughout the conversation. I believe it was hopelessness and helplessness. And so you seem to really emphasize those as key distinctions for you. And it also feels like part of what you're saying is, and I agree, there's a broad spectrum of depression. Anywhere from I'm having a bad day all the way up to I'm clinically depressed and I need to talk to a doctor, I need to get help. And for anyone who's listening, I appreciated this in the book. If you are having challenges, then definitely reach out, get help. Suicide hotline, talk to it. Neither of us is a medical doctor. We are not offering medical advice, and we want to make sure everyone is okay. And similar to Brian, I've been dealing with depression myself now for, I guess, going on 18 years. Wow, it feels a lot longer when I say it that way, Brian. But so we've got this broad spectrum, and part of what we want to be able to do is recognize where we are on that spectrum at different points in time.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think it can be hard for us to necessarily pinpoint where we are. I think because on that spectrum, knowing the intricacies of each point, like it's like, okay, to be here, it means we sort of have to exhibit these symptoms or have expressed certain things in our minds and bodies for a long enough period of time. But at the same time, understanding that, you don't necessarily need to be hopeless for years on end in order to say that I'm finally depressed, right? It's like the feeling, as you mentioned, the feelings of hopelessness and helplessness are the ones that are core to this experience. And so whenever you are experiencing those emotions for an extended duration, which I would say anything more than a week, right? It's like if those feelings are getting in the way of you living the life that you want to, or they are hindering your everyday life, then no matter what your doctor would diagnose that as, it becomes a problem in your life that you realize you eventually need to solve. And so it's like, let's get rid of the labels, because I don't know if they're necessarily serving us. What's really going on is we feel these really negative and awful emotions. And so from that starting point, it's like, what do we need to do to move forward?
So one of the fascinating things I've always found about depression, right, is anytime randomly in my life where I've thought, hey, maybe I should just wean myself off my medication. Note to self, don't ever make that decision yourself. Talk to a doctor. It's never worked. Things feel great. No issues. And then maybe not as great. And then all of a sudden, it's like a knock on the head. And it's like, oh, shoot, I let this get too far. And what I mean by that, Brian, is it's so incremental, right? And one of the powers of compounding in life, I always say for the positive, and now that I think about it, with depression, it's for the negative. But for almost anything where you're exercising or you're investing, the incremental improvements go slow until they go fast. And so depression, for a lot of us, we may not notice that on Tuesday I was a little bit less positive than Monday. On Wednesday, and then we fast forward 2 months and we're laying in bed and our partner's saying, hey, it's time to go to work. And we just pull the covers over our head and say, I don't want to leave the house. So what can we do on that checking in on the spectrum to catch it when it's still at the incremental stage before it's hit the exponential?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think I might want to segue it a little bit and kind of take things in a slightly different direction, because there are plenty of things that we can do and we will get to those things. But in some ways, what we're talking about is awareness, and the awareness it's undeniably difficult to cultivate, right? I think if we could always recognize where we're at, like if we could say, oh, I'm 25% of the way into the abyss, right? And then take action against that, nip it in the bud, we probably wouldn't need to have as many conversations like this one. But that is one of the most difficult parts, right? Going back to our previous conversation, it's like, okay, I have my 10 steps to getting out of your head, which are 10 things you can walk through when you're already feeling anxious. The problem is once you become anxious, you lose some of your awareness. And when you lose that awareness, it's hard for you to recognize the fact that you have these steps at your disposal and you need to take them out, right? So it's this constant battle. And I don't know if battle is the right word, but it's definitely, it's an ongoing challenge, right? Where it's like over the course of your life, over the course of your battle with mental illness, you are developing the muscle of awareness. And it's a legitimate muscle. It's a metaphorically legitimate muscle where it's a skill that we need to cultivate. And the more times that we go through a process like this, we build that muscle a little bit more. When I was saying I wanted to segue things a tiny bit, what I wanted to talk about was this concept, and it was actually the second question that you had asked at the beginning of the show, which was state machines. Yeah. So let's break this down a little bit and see if I can remember all the thoughts that are kind of swirling around in my head right now. But so the state machine, it's a concept, like the concept comes from computer science, and it's based on this notion that like computers, computer systems, computer software or programs, they function based on the state that they are currently in. And so a state, if we say, what is a state? It is basically a configuration. So that could be the way that some data looks in the current system right now. If we're playing a video game or something like that, the state would be like, is our character alive? Does our character have full health, maybe half health? And then based on whatever that data is or that information is, that determines how the game or the software program runs. And so if we take this concept of like, a state machine, so I guess one thing that I'll add back in there is like sort of the formal definition is like the state machine is basically a representation of how the computer system works. And so it's almost this map where we can draw and we can say like, these are all the different states that the system can get into and out of. And then here are the things, here's how the system works when it's in each state. And then also, these are the ways by which we get to and from each one of those states. So it's this high level concept, I guess, to try to put this abstract analogy into the concrete a little bit, right? We could say that, if we're going with this theme of a video game, if we are our character, we could say is in the full life state. Okay, so when they're in the full life state, let's say Super Mario, right? He's jumping around excitedly. He can jump higher than normal or whatever it is. And then if he gets attacked by a character or, an enemy, he would move to maybe the half-life state or, like a powered down state or something like that. And then in the powered down state, he's not able to run as fast. He's not able to jump as high. So again, just sort of this basic idea of like, okay, state 1, state 2, and however many states that we want to have, but this is how we get to and from each one. This is how we act in each one. So if we take this high-level concept and we apply it to our lives, we can say that, to some degree, I would say probably a pretty good degree, we function as a result of the states that we are in. And then from all of those states, we can create a map and say, okay, these are the feelings or emotions that I experience. These are the states that I get into and out of on a daily basis. These are the things that sometimes bring me to those states. These are the ways that I act in each of those states. And then if I'm in a particular one, this is how I can get into or out of it, right? So that's kind of our high level intro. And then I think the next important thing to say is that, so if we talk about, or, I mentioned the fact that the way that we act is a product of the state that we are in. Same thing, with a computer system. The way that we think and the way that we feel is also a product of the state that we're in. And so if we're in a depressed state, we're going to be seeing things differently than than when we're happy. We're going to be thinking different thoughts. We're going to be more interested in carrying out certain activities I guess if we're depressed, less interested in carrying out certain activities than we would if we were, say, happy. And so, where we're going with all of this, right, when we're talking about like, the state machines and everything that we have talked about so far, it's like, I think it's an important distinction to make that. So we were talking about a little bit about, awareness and how do we catch ourselves when we are, creeping back toward depression and whatnot. I think an important distinction to make is that it is really difficult to catch ourselves to actually, go through that process. And one of the reasons why is because when we're depressed or we're a little bit depressed, we, based on that state machine model, we think a little bit differently. We see things a little bit differently. Maybe even our beliefs shift a little bit, or at least like, our outlooks on the world change a little bit. And so that's one thing that can be challenging. Now, I think the other side of that coin is that if we're talking, bringing things full circle and talking about that awareness muscle is it's almost like first order thinking is like, hey, when we're depressed or we're getting close to depressed, that awareness is really difficult to find. And it's like, if we stop there, that's pretty daunting, right? But I'd say layer 2, if we go deeper than that, we can say to ourselves, look, I know that this awareness is difficult to find. I know that, the uplifting beliefs, the positive thought patterns are going to be hard to find right now. But knowing how this model works, I can step back and say to myself, this is not a product of the world. This is not a product of my circumstances. This is not a product of how things actually are. This is a product of how I feel right now. And so if I can then do different things that will help me change how I feel, I will see things differently. I will have maybe different beliefs in my mind. I will have different emotions running through my body. And so I think I'm going to stop there because that's a lot of different information, but that's like that was my core thesis that I wanted to get out today, which was basically like emotions are so powerful and so important. And when we harness them the right way, and then when we kind of bring in that awareness, we unlock a really powerful skill in our battles with mental health and depression.
Well, one of the things that you were getting across there that you write about and that I align with is that relative to our current state, right? And it's a bit matrixy, if you will. And so it's good we're talking computer games, but it's that we don't perceive the world as it is, Rather, we perceive the world as we are. Do you want to highlight that distinction as it relates to what you were talking about the cloudiness that the depression can provide in our lens and how it changes? Because part of what we're talking about is, there's reality, and then there's our perception of reality. And how does that drive what we're sharing?
Definitely. I think rather than like go deeper into what you said, I think that's sort of the capstone. That's almost like the, break this down into one sentence and make it digestible for folks, is to say just that line, which is, to repeat it. It's like, we see the world not as it is, but as we are. So it's like that state that we are in right now, that governs how we're viewing the world, our outlooks on today, tomorrow, a year from now, and whatnot. And so it's almost, people talk about in mental health or even just in self-help in general, like rose-tinted glasses. When we are hopeful, we're wearing rose-tinted glasses. And when we're depressed, we're wearing brown-tinted glasses or, gray-tinted glasses, something that doesn't really serve us, doesn't look so good.
So one of the things we're going to chat about a fair amount, because we're going to try to, talk through some different tools people have and some different ways they can approach life to, in essence, put us into a different state so that how we are changes, which will affect how we see things, right? So change the state, in a different state, in a better state. Now I perceive things differently. My hopelessness, my helplessness, maybe they disappear. And one of the things you talk about, which was a bit new to me, is we traditionally think of depression biomedical model, right? Which I assume is hey, let's throw some Wellbutrin at that. Let's throw some of this at that, SSRIs or what have you. And let's deal with the chemical imbalance. And one of the things you talk about is the biopsychosocial model, which mixes multiple different avenues. Can you explain the difference between these two models and why we want to zone in on this, on the biopsychosocial?
Sure. Yeah, I think a little bit of background is in order, right? So the biopsychosocial model is a holistic framework for viewing diseases, right? Explaining how they arise, manifest in our bodies and whatnot. Biomedical model is another framework. And so, as you alluded to, like the biomedical one is sort of more focused on the body itself, right? We would say, depression is a result of a chemical imbalance in our brains. And so if we take some pills that solve that chemical imbalance, then boom, we're good, right? I think when we look deeper, I think the reason why I wrote the book, and I wrote the book on top of the biopsychosocial model, the reason why I did that is when you look deeper, depression is more complicated than that, right? It's not necessarily just a chemical imbalance in the brain, or at the very least, there are different inputs than just, pharmaceutical drugs into how our neurotransmitters operate. And so what I wanted to do, I was like, hey, being the non-scientific or non-medical person that I am, when I was researching the book, I was like, okay, what are some other ways that we can explain how depression arises? What's a framework that could serve as a backdrop for my book? And I was thinking about all the different kinds of strategies and approaches that I was going to write about in the book. And I was like, well, this biopsychosocial model fits the bill pretty well, because it's like, okay, so if we dissect that word, it's sort of an amalgamation of three different words, which is, so it's biopsychosocial, so it's biological, psychological, and social. And so if we think about it, there's basically like three different buckets in our lives. And I'm sure there's more, but like those are some of the, if we're like, what are the broadest buckets that we could group different things into our lives into? Those would sort of be them, right? So if we think about, if we say this is a framework that helps us figure out how diseases arise in the body or how something makes its way into our life, we could say, okay, on the biological level, it's like, if we're not eating the right foods, if we're not getting exercise, if we're not lifting weights or something like that, it's possible. And also, obviously pharmaceutical angle there, where it's like biological could also sort of mean like, neurotransmitters and whatnot, where if we consume a pill or something, it could change our chemical makeup, and then maybe that could lead us to some relief from our depression. And then if we're looking at the psychological side of things, that's basically, our thoughts, our beliefs, the things that are swirling through our heads, not necessarily the neurotransmitters, because it's more like one level up. It's like what thoughts, what beliefs lead to which neurotransmitters firing in our brains to which degree. And then social is kind of everything else. So that's our family life, our friends, our jobs, connections, relationships, where we work, all that sort of stuff. I think the only major one that I left out was genetics, and that would be biological as well, right? Because it's like, it's from the body. So, it's possible that depression runs in your family, and it's hard to evade something like that. But at the same time, people will use the metaphor that like genes load the gun, but lifestyle pulls the trigger. And so if that's a real thing, right? I'm, again, not a doctor, so don't know for sure, but I think we've all heard that one time or another. If that is true, then in theory, we could say that, okay, maybe we do have a genetic disposition toward depression. But at the same time, if we level up, our psychological and social worlds, and then also supplement ourselves with the right things from the biological sphere. So that could be a proper diet, getting lots of exercise, all things that can be proven in various studies to help combat depression. It is possible that, using that analogy again, we don't pull the trigger, right? We may, again, the gun might be loaded, but we are doing the things to help help prevent that gun from getting fired. And so, that is sort of the framework upon which I wrote the book. And it basically just gave me a backdrop to be able to say, like, here's how I group the different things that are going to be coming forward in the book. I think the other thing too, right, I touched upon quickly a minute ago was basically there are so many different kinds of depression. There are so many different stories. And I think when you hear all those stories, you're like, the standard model of, hey, this person has a chemical imbalance in their brain, and if they take a pill, that's the solution for everyone. You quickly realize that that's not the case, right? And I talk about in the book, like, I'm not somebody who is against medication. I am just somebody who, looks at all the different science, looks at the research studies and says, here's what's working for this person, here's what's working for that person. Why don't we take all of these different things, right? If we're saying that the biopsychosocial model is comprised of 3 different prongs and that they all interact with one another to potentially create, the conditions that we know as depression, hopelessness, maybe some other mental health conditions, why don't we get all those things revved up, right? And so it's like, even though I may say in the book that a medication only plan or treatment plan is not necessarily the best one, I'm not necessarily rallying against medication either. What I'm saying is, if our doctor recommends that we take medication, we should try it. And then we should work with that doctor to say, hey, look, it's been 60 days, it's been 6 months, here's how I'm feeling. It's working, it's not working, let's dial it up, let's dial it down. And at the same time, we should be looking into all the different other sources, in those, in the biopsychosocial spheres, to be able to say, like, hey, how else can I help combat this thing? Am I getting enough exercise? Am I eating enough omega-3s? Am I getting sunlight every day? Am I surrounding myself with people that uplift me and inspire me and help me feel connected? Am I, pursuing meaning and purpose in my career? All those different sorts of things. So this was a long answer, so I'm going to pause there.
Well, you're stealing all our thunder for the future questions, Brian. Which are all the areas we're going to talk through, because those are what you talk about on how to deal with it, which I appreciated. And, I stole a little thunder for the next question earlier when I was talking about the whirlpools into darkness. And that ties to what you were saying on perception and how we see things. I thought you did a really good job of talking about the perception cycle and how it can bring us down slowly over time. Do you want to get a little into that, and we can talk a little bit about how it ties to both of our experiences? Because I think it almost mimics what I was saying, where we start incrementally and then we just slowly start spinning down until all of a sudden we're in the abyss.
Yeah. So the perception cycle in the book was sort of this concept that I gave to the general idea of like being in a long-term mindset that changes how we see the world, and then that mindset affecting the action that we take or don't take, the results that we then get from that action or inaction, and then the conclusions that we draw from that, again, that action or inaction, or the results that we do or don't get, and then, cycle back to a belief or a feeling or a state that we're in. And so, in depression, you were talking about like downward spirals and whatnot, right? I think, there's so many different ways by which we can enter depression, but let's just use an example, right? If we say, hey, I'm depressed because I feel as though I should be in an intimate relationship and I am not, right? I'm a certain age. I have always felt as though, and I'm being hypothetical, but it's like, I've always felt as though, the opposite sex does not, or the sex I'm interested in doesn't reciprocate. They don't like me. I'm ugly. I'm not funny, something like that. And so with that mindset, right, it's like over the years, that mindset has in one way or another cultivated our lack of results, because it's like, so going with this perception cycle thing, it's like the state that we are in is some sort of pervasive state of like, I'm not good enough. And so with that, we then look around and we say, well, if I'm not good enough, then I'm going to feel depressed. And so if I feel depressed and I'm not good enough, I look around and I say, hey, there's an opportunity, but I'm not going to take it because my mindset says to me, talking to that person is futile. Asking that person out is never going to lead anywhere. I'm always going to screw things up. Things are never going to work out. And then let's say 6 months to a year go by, and we look back and we say, hey, look, I'm not in a relationship and I must be, unworthy, unlovable, not interesting, something like that. Because look, if I was, I'd be in a relationship by now. Another year has gone by. And then that reinforces our mindset. And so that leads us to some sort of downward spiral. I think on the other side of things where, we say to ourselves, like, look, I am where I am, having that awareness piece of like, look, I don't feel good. I'm disappointed in the fact that I'm not where I want to be. But, that result or where I am today is a product of my past thoughts, my past action or inaction, not necessarily, some innate character flaw or something like that. We could then have the awareness to say, look, regardless of what's happened in the past, regardless of how I feel right now, regardless of my disappointment and depression over my current situation, I choose to believe different things. And when I believe different things, I'm then empowered to take more action. And then with that action, right, it's like until we actually go out in the world and pursue action or try to make our goals come to life, it's not very likely that they will. And so it's like with a better mindset, we take more action. And I'm not saying like this isn't one of those like glorified things of like, hey, just take the action and all your dreams will come true. It's like some things are very difficult and they take time and they take, a relentless pursuit. But it's like going with this story again, it's like, okay, a year later, 6 months later, we can look back and say, I developed a new mindset. I created new beliefs. I got myself into a better state. I went out, I took action. I had some results come, and those results, sort of poked holes in my previous beliefs and then reinforced a cycle of like, look, I am good enough. I am capable of doing this sort of thing. And then the next thing we know, or maybe it's a year, maybe it's 2 years or something like that. But we're building those muscles. They're metaphorical or mental, but they're ones where it's like, we can look back in time and say, hey, I made change.
So it sounds like a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy of downward spiral, right? I don't think I'm good enough, hence I behave in a way that shows I'm not good enough, which reinforces that I'm good enough, which makes me, or I'm not good enough, which makes me behave even more like I'm, you know what I mean? And so action is a bit of the way out of that. So you talk in the next chapter, you talk about a couple of things and you hinted at them there and we'll dive right into them. The first one you talk about is cognitive behavioral therapy. So when you bring up CBT, and CBT to me, when I found it in the book, I think you and I may have talked about Feeling Good, the new mood therapy back in the day by Dr. David Burns, which has a lot of CBT in it, and life-changing, whether it's depression or even more importantly. Number one thing I found CBT did, now that I'm talking to you in the state machine, is nothing had ever taught me prior to CBT that the way I saw the world was not the world. And it was CBT through thought auditing, and maybe this is where we'll take it, because I'll pass it over to you. It was CBT through thought auditing that taught me my thinking was flawed, and I needed to fix my thinking. And that was possibly the most life-changing book or process I ever underwent. And so on that note, I'll pass it over to you to educate the team on what is CBT and why is it so important to us in altering our state machines.
Yeah, I mean, I probably won't add too much on top of what you mentioned. It's basically, it's a program, or I guess it is let me get the word right. I think it's a psychosocial form of treatment, if I have that right. Not 100% sure off the top of my head, but it's a new approach to the mental health game. And when I say new, it's semi-alternative, right? You talked about David Burns. I think he wrote Feeling Good. I don't even remember when it came out, probably the 80s or something like that. I guess we could look it up right now. Let's see. It's definitely been a while, but
yeah, and he came out in the last few years with Feeling Great. And, I say to everybody, I haven't read the new one, but great sounds better than good. So, if I was going to choose between the two, I'd probably go with the new updated one.
Yeah, and I'm sure they're both very good. I read Feeling Good, just checked it out. It came out in 1980. So I say new, but I kind of mean alternative, right? When we think about depression or we think about mental health, I think a lot of us, the discussion does sort of lean toward medication. And when you introduce a concept like CBT, or you talk about a book like Feeling Good, and actually, I believe Aaron Beck was actually the one who, I believe he was the father of cognitive therapy.
No, he was, one of two fathers of CBT. There was two of them. But where they came from was interesting, and you may not have known it, but you talk about this in the book as well. So we'll get there. I'll share that with you in a bit.
Cool, yeah. So I mean, it's like, without cognitive therapy, there's probably no cognitive behavioral therapy, or at the very least, it takes a little bit longer to develop. It's basically just, a new framework, or I don't even know what the right word is. It's some sort of mental health treatment where we look at the thoughts that go on through our minds and how they affect how we feel. And it's really important because I think in a lot of ways, it's like, if we knew from day one that the thoughts running through our heads and the thoughts that we create in our own minds really exacerbated, or, exacerbated our mental health conditions, or at the very least, they influenced the degree to which we experienced anxiety, depression, OCD, something like that. If we all knew that from an earlier stage, I think we probably would have had a better start in the mental health game. I think, one way or another, we all eventually get to that content and we learn, its teachings. But it's like, I remember as a high school student, it was like, I had no idea that, even though it's looking back, it does feel kind of obvious. It's like, when I was 17, I had no idea that I shouldn't be thinking scary thoughts, and that those scary thoughts were perpetuating how I was feeling, which was maybe in turn, creating bodily symptoms that then, I would then react to those bodily symptoms and say, oh my God, why is that happening? And then feel even more anxious, or depending on what it was I was going through, like possibly more depressed or something like that. So yeah, I mean, CBT is a really powerful tool. It's, allows us to be able to step back and say to ourselves, like, one, thoughts are important and they're really powerful. And two, if we then step back and say, hey, these are the thoughts that are going through my head on a regular basis, and this is how they are serving me or not serving me, it then kind of, serves as the basis for us to be able to turn around and make changes where we think is necessary. So yeah, I talked about CBT in both books, volume 1 and volume 2, but it's kind of one of those things like the biopsychosocial model, where it's a very solid backdrop for a lot of the rest of the content that I put through. And I think if, kind of mirroring what I said a minute ago, is like, if we come to the table without even knowing that our thoughts influence how we feel on a biological and psychological level, we're sort of at a disadvantage. And so once we introduce that concept and then really go and do the hard work of saying, hey, I'm honest with myself. These are the thoughts that I've been thinking. I'm now realizing that they're not serving me, right? They're making me feel worse or whatever. That's sort of our jumping off point for then getting into some mental health healing.
Well, you nailed a very important thing right there, because one of the things you talked about was, are these thoughts, or is this way of thinking serving me any longer, right? One of the things that we dive into a lot in shadow work is a lot of the behaviors, the thought processes that we have at some point in our life when we were going through something at some age, they served us. Now, I had a past guest on, and his example was a baby. And when a baby takes a crap in its diaper, it gets changed. And so that behavior serves the baby. And then you hit a certain age and you probably should stop that behavior. And so it's the same with our thoughts. When we thought a certain thing, it may have served us for whatever reason. But as we're adults, and you're saying, well, when I was in high school, when I was 17, I should have realized that my thinking had an impact on me. But I mean, Brian, most adults don't even realize that. And so I think, it wasn't on you, it's on the system. We don't teach kids that. We don't teach adults that. And so recognizing what thoughts, I think the first thing is, what thoughts am I having? And for those who have never done it, write them down, right? Oh, I just had a thought. Write it down. And then what you're able to do is you can leave it for a while and come back and examine it impartially. Was that thought logical? Was it reasonable? What are 4 or 5 more logical alternatives? And the more you do that, the more you train your brain to only allow the thoughts that are logical. And Brian, where they actually peeled CBT from, and I'll throw it out now because we talk about it a bit later, is Stoicism. So later when we talk about suffering, we'll dive into Stoicism. And Stoicism was actually the forefather of cognitive behavioral therapy, because one of the primary tenets with Stoics was that you should only give, the way they referred to it, you should only give assent or permission to those thoughts that were logical. So they would examine their thoughts, and if their thoughts were not logical, they wouldn't give them permission to remain in their minds. And so when Beck read that, they realized, wait a second, like these Stoics were onto something. We should explore how we can use this in modern day psychology, modern day science to help people through mental issues. So definitely onto that. The next area you dive into is disempowering beliefs. And you break that into 3 areas. Disempowering beliefs about ourselves, our world, and our future. So those seem to be 3 of the areas that drive depressive states. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, and I don't want to even try to take credit for this. This is Beck's cognitive triad, or the negative triad. So pretty popular and sort of well-known framework, which is basically like, Beck was basically saying when our beliefs about ourselves, our world, and our futures are negative and also pervasive, like it's inevitable that we will experience some depression, right? If you say to yourself, like, I'm worthless, I'm lousy, that, the world is a terrible and evil place and things are never going to get better in the future. It's like that is the embodiment of helplessness and hopelessness. And, as we talked about at the beginning of the show, those 2 emotions, helplessness and hopelessness, are sort of the basis of depression. And so it's like when we experience those things and when we continue to keep those thoughts and beliefs in our minds, it's really hard to escape those emotions.
And so what do these disempowering beliefs look like? And how can we use CBT or other mental tools to combat the mental side of it? Before we dive into the biological side, how do we go about psychologically attacking these disempowering beliefs?
Yeah, I think we've honestly covered a lot of it already. And just to kind of reiterate, right, it's basically awareness, and then I guess a concept that we have touched upon but maybe haven't named yet, which would be pattern recognition. Just being able to see in our minds, right? Sort of, there's this concept of like metacognition, which is basically, if you break it down, it's like meta is sort of like, it's almost like of the thing itself, and then cognition is thinking. So it's like thinking about thinking. If we can sort of be a passive observer of our thoughts, which, that's sort of one thing that meditation can be really helpful for, is like, if we can step back and say, rather than attach myself to the negative thoughts in my mind right now, rather than go back into these beliefs that don't serve me and like really go into the nitty gritty of them and think about all these scary things off in the future right now, let me kind of like pull myself back and just observe them. And then, as we were saying a minute ago, it's like, okay, write those things down and say to yourself, like, these are the patterns that I run more often than not, or these are the patterns that I run that make me feel the way I do. And by feeling, I mean, it's like, helpless, hopeless, depressed, whatever. And then through that pattern recognition, or through that awareness, or even the process of just writing those things down, we can then develop the awareness and the pattern recognition to say, like, hey, in the future, right? Let's say fast forward a week later, a month later, or something like that, we may see the wheels in our mind turning. And then because we did that work to write our beliefs down and to write our thoughts down, we might be able to say, like, hey, that's my mind doing that thing again. And I know I shouldn't be doing that. And I'm looking at my journal and I'm saying, like, I always think these certain thoughts. I fall into this belief, and look, I'm doing it right now. So I think that's a really important process too. And, I think one of the things to cover in this is like, the fact that, I think we want to say, hey, here's this like magic pill, or here's this magic formula that will help us, get out of anxiety, depression immediately. And I'm not saying that things like that don't exist, right? It's like, if we're feeling really anxious and a doctor has prescribed Xanax to us, like something like that, like what are those called? Those are the, not barbiturates, those are the benzodiazepines, right? Like some doctors could refer to those as like emergency medicines. It's like, hey, don't take those all the time, but if you're having like a panic attack, a serious breakdown, maybe take something like that. But at the same time, if you don't need that medication right away, it's like, try some of these strategies, right? Write your beliefs down. Try to recognize the patterns that are going on in your mind. And so what I was getting at there was sort of like, we want mental health to be this simple silver bullet kind of thing, or at least to have silver bullet solutions. And I think when we really get into the nitty gritty, I think we see that a lot of mental health is not sexy, right? The long-term process of developing pattern recognition to say, these are the thoughts that go on through my mind on a regular basis. These are the beliefs that I hold, and I need to do the difficult work to chip away at them and replace them with new ones. That's difficult work. It's not sexy, but that's sort of where we are, right? And as soon as we accept that fate, and then once we do that, I think we're better able to stop resisting the process and just focus on moving forward.
So part of what I'm hearing on this one, and then we'll dive into the next one, is I'm getting a journal. And on a daily basis, I'm writing down some of my thoughts that I'm having, and I'm examining them. Because if I look at the perception cycle, and I know that every time I say that I can't get that girl or I can't get that job, that's going to drive me to the next step in the cycle. And so if I write that down and I see it, I'm saying, whoa, check in. I just wrote down something that I know is step 1 on the 7 steps of heading to the abyss. And I need to check that. And right beside it, I may write, I can get that job. I can get that girl if I do this, right? And then I'm taking that action. So that seems like a path there. One of the other things, and I'm sure they have apps for this, I know they have it in some journals, is that like a daily inventory, right? What's my mood? How am I feeling? What am I grateful for? What are three positive things I can say about today? So that I'm checking in on not only my thoughts, but my emotions, my mood throughout the day. Does that sound like a couple tools we should throw into the toolkit?
Yeah, that would be awesome. I mean, I have not done the work of checking out the space and figuring out what apps are out there in terms of like, thought and feeling journals, but I got to imagine that they are out there. And so I am in full support of, if somebody were to find one of those applications and put that into their toolkit or to leverage it in their daily lives, like I'm in full support of that.
Or we'll create it as the get out of your head app. So write that one down. I know you're a computer developer. I'm sure a software developer, we can whip something up on this one. One of the things I appreciate the way you write is taking the biopsychosocial model and attacking from all angles. One of the best things that I thought you talked about that is so simple for us to implement is you talked about the fact that even if we fix our thinking in our bodies, we can still be triggered by our environment. And you highlighted, I believe it's the Kaluli tribe and the way they live and the fact that there's no depression in that tribe. Can you share some of the things that they do in their daily lives that we can incorporate into ours as a way to address it from the social side?
Yeah, well, why don't I take a quick step back and just kind of give a high level view of what's going on here, which was basically, so we're talking about a chapter in the book that, or at least a subsection that, says the statement is that depression is or could be a product of the modern lifestyle. And so when I break that down, I say, enough stress in our lives can sometimes accumulate to the point at which we fall into a state of learned helplessness. If we are constantly stressed out, if we're always going to work and our boss is breathing down our necks and, he or she is a stress-inducing person, and then we come home to, our spouses or our boyfriend, girlfriend or something like that, and, it's a hostile environment at home, and then, we've got our cell phones and we're always getting these notifications and alerts and things like that are just constantly stressing us out, we can fall into sort of this learned helplessness mindset where we say, no matter what I do, no matter where I go, I'm encountering all this stress. And so rather than even try to fight it off, because I can't predict where it's going to come from, I don't know what it's going to be like, but I know that it's pervasive, I'm just going to sort of resign myself back into, my helplessness and my hopelessness. Going along that path, one of the other things that I talked about was that, depression being a disease of the modern lifestyle. So we talked about the fact that, I briefly touched upon the fact that it's like, hey, on our cell phones, we might have notifications that trigger us, right? We might have like harrowing news headlines that come through our feeds and, Instagram posts of people who remind us that we don't stack up, we're not good enough, whatever. Obviously, those sorts of notifications and comparisons are products of the modern world. We didn't have things like that, 100 years ago, 200 years ago. If we continue stepping into this, depression, the idea of depression being a disease of the modern lifestyle, we say, okay, the way that we live today, the average person eats a diet, the standard American diet, SAD, right? A lot of processed foods, a lot of processed fats, a lot of unhealthy foods that don't have a lot of nutrition in them. That affects our bodies, that affects our minds. There's some papers out there that show that when we don't have enough omega-3s, which is that not having enough omega-3s is, what's the word I'm looking for? I'll put it another way. The standard American diet does not supply us with enough omega-3s. And when we don't have enough omega-3s, it can lead to depression, or it can at least help us exhibit some symptoms that look like depression. And so there's some papers out there that show when we take omega-3 supplements, and I'm not saying that you necessarily should if you're listening, I'm just saying maybe talk to your doctor about it. There are some papers out there that show that omega-3s can blunt some of the symptoms of depression or how we're feeling. So let's, kind of tangenting a little bit, but we'll keep going down this path. So, the modern lifestyle, right? We talked about, not having a proper diet, not having enough omega-3s. The average American, and I'm guilty of this as well, is like, we are relatively sedentary people, right? We sit on the couch a lot. We sit at our desks at work. That is not how our bodies were constructed. We are meant to be relatively active people. And a lot of folks might say okay, go out and get exercise. That will help you combat depression. But at the same time, it's like if we're only doing 20 minutes of exercise and then we're going back to the couch and we're sitting on the couch all day, for most of the day, our bodies are in that sedentary state. And so that's not helpful either. We also spend a lot of time indoors. We don't get a lot of sunlight. And, sunlight can provide us with vitamin D, and vitamin D can sometimes be helpful in the battle against depression. And so we're looking at all these different things, right? The modern lifestyle, how does that contribute to our experience of depression? There's a lot of papers out there that show that those things do, and that, for one way or another, depression is a disease of the modern lifestyle, or at least can be. And so we can look, one of the things we can do is I referenced a couple of studies in the book, which was basically saying, like, if we look at groups of people that have yet to adopt a modern way of life, and we look at them and we say, hey, what's the case rate of depression in those environments, in those people? Is it the same as America or something like that? If it's not, then we want to know, what's going on there. And I do want to be careful and say that, correlation doesn't always equal causation, right? Like, some of these things are multifaceted problems where it's like there's a lot of different inputs into the situations. But a couple of things I talked about, so one of them being the Kaluli tribe of Papua New Guinea, like, they are basically an old school tribe of hunter-gatherers. They, I don't exactly know how many people are in each clan, but it's like they're out in the woods hunting for food. They're getting plenty of sunlight. They're getting plenty of exercise. They're eating real natural foods, right? And I don't know if I want to stress that too much or anything like that, but it's like they're out eating real plants. They're out, maybe, killing an animal and eating basically the freshest meat that is out there. And so researchers went and looked at this tribe and saw that they have basically 0 cases of mental illness on a yearly basis. And it's like, okay, what's going on there, right? And again, correlation doesn't equal causation, so it's difficult to say. But I think if we go along this path, and some of the research points to this, is like, if we say that, all the things I talked about, improper diet, sedentariness, not having connections with those around us, not getting enough sunlight and exercise and whatnot, if those things lead to depression, and this group over here, they're doing all those things or getting all the proper versions of those things, and they don't have any mental health problems, like, wow, we might be onto something. So yeah, that was what I was getting at there. basically just trying to say like, so that is a little bit of the biopsychosocial model, right? There's a bunch of different things there. So it's like on the social side, they live in these tight-knit tribes where they have close connections with one another. They're out like, they're brothers and sisters, like hunting for food. Like I don't know if it gets more meaningful and more connected than that. And then I guess to touch on a couple of the other ones, right? Like sunlight, probably biological, getting enough exercise, also biological, or, being out and, walking around and trying to hunt your food and whatnot. So a bunch of different things that fall into those three various categories. But I think it's just a fascinating story when you look at it and you say like, wow, we in the US, we think we have it all figured out. And I think you're up in Canada, Clint, but it's like in Canada, I'm sure it's sort of the same thing where it's like
a lot less sunlight.
Yeah. It's like, we think we have it all figured out and we're like this amazing nation. Don't get me wrong. Like I'm very proud of my country and it's an awesome place to live. But at the same time, it's like, we do have a long way to go in terms of mental health. And to think otherwise is, I don't know, it's sort of crazy, right? Especially when you hear stories like that one.
Well, I mean, let's dive into it because we learned so much during COVID, right? And good and bad. So let's dive into a couple of things you talked about, right? Because the first one, you talk about connectedness versus isolation, right? So during COVID, a lot of lockdowns, a lot of people living at home by themselves. And if we saw anything, we know isolation equals amplification. People who have never had mental health issues off the charts, right? I know a lot of people who are talking to me about parents who've never had mental health issues and now in the 70s, in the late 60s, and they're expressing mental health issues, right? Now, flip it on its head. I think a lot of us realized I was not built to wake up, commute for an hour, sit in an office for 10 hours, commute home, eat McDonald's with a big gulp on the drive, and then watch Netflix and go to bed after a couple beers. Like, we just realized on both sides of the spectrum, this is not good for my mental health. And I think that has a lot of people, Brian, really rethinking, how was I meant to live? What do my connections need to look like? What does my job need to look like? What about my commute? How do I want to eat? How do I want to spend time with friends and family? What have you been seeing and what have you been experiencing as you've gone through this wonderful last 2 and a bit years now?
Yeah, I think you touch upon a lot of great things. I like the fact that you made it really concrete of saying, hey, we're going through COVID. I'm reevaluating my life. I'm saying, am I meant to live this particular way? I think whenever we can talk about the state of the world in that fashion, it's really helpful because it's so relatable for a lot of folks. In terms of what I have heard and lived through and whatnot in the last couple of years, you look at the statistics and you basically see everything that you just talked about, where we were locked down in our houses. And even if we weren't locked down, after a certain number of months, it was like we still had massive amounts of uncertainty in knowing that there was this disease out there that at any moment, like anyone you knew could get it. And, for different people and different age groups, it was more or less problematic, but it was still like, we lost a lot of people worldwide to this thing, and that's awful. And that doesn't help our mental health. And then at the same time, it's like, okay, well, now maybe we can't go hang out with all of our friends or our family members, or we need to be cautious about these things. And, it definitely got us in an anxious loop, if nothing else. But then also the sort of follow-on effects of, sort of as you mentioned, like not being able to connect with everybody that we want to, not having that sense of, those tight relationships and feeling isolated. That's a very easy way for us to fall into depression. And so, when we were looking at the statistics and, you say, hey, anxiety and depression are at sort of all-time highs in this COVID era, it's obviously sad. It's obviously disappointing. But at the same time, I look at it and I'm like, well, no crap, right? I mean, you add a global pandemic, a ton of social isolation, a lot of like weirdness with like the metaverse and everybody trying to live these like online personas where we don't have, real bonds with real people. And it's like, what else did you expect to happen? So, that is kind of the state of the world. And again, it's sad because I hate to see people suffer and I don't want that to happen any longer. But I think on the flip side, I think that it has been beneficial in small parts, right? Where people are now being able to, they've had the time to step back and reevaluate their lives, as you alluded to, right? The fact that maybe we didn't have to go into the office all the time. People were afforded the ability to say, look, I'm going to take my extra time. I'm going to figure out what I want out of my life. We've seen this movement called the Great Resignation, where a lot of people are realizing that, hey, I don't want to go work for $12 an hour, $15 an hour, or something like that. I don't even know what I want to do. I just have realized that, that sort of life that you talked about, Clint, where you were like, get on the train, commute, work for a long time, get some fast food, come home, watch Netflix. Like, I don't want to do that. I'm destined for, better, greater things than that. So it's a mishmash of good and bad events and outcomes in this COVID period. But I'm hopeful that, I guess I'll say this. It is obvious that the mental health conversation has expanded over this time. And I think overall, that's a very good thing, right? The more people are talking about this stuff, the more people can feel like what they're going through is not crazy, right? It's like, okay, I am maybe just like someone else. I'm not any different. I don't need to feel bad about how I'm feeling. I don't need to feel bad about feeling bad. And that, that can help us get out of that sort of like recursive depression, recursive anxiety and whatnot. So I do think overall there have been good and bad outcomes associated with this period. But I'm hopeful that the conversation will grow. People will find more strategies to cope. More people will come together, possibly physically in terms of like, now that COVID is hopefully settling down. But at the same time, I think people will come together in, I don't know what the right word is, some sort of like commiseration or something like that, where it's like people are more willing to be open and vulnerable after this period of seeing a lot of people suffer. And I think people are willing to say, hey, I experienced that too. I'm putting my hand up like, hey, you went through that. I went through that. Let's talk about it, right? Rather than necessarily this sort of like, especially for men, like some sort of macho culture that we've created over the years because, pushing down how we're feeling and not thinking, like sort of not facing, our own demons. I think that usually leads to more harmful effects in the long run. So that's kind of how I'm feeling about it. And obviously touched upon a bunch of different things there, but yeah, that's sort of it.
To one and I'll go there and it jumps ahead in the book and then we can come back to some of the other stuff. But when you talk about men, right, and are pushing down the emotions, one of the biggest things I've noticed in men's work, Brian, is in the time that I was in it and in the books that I read on the topic, are that men suffer in silence and we don't seek out relationship, right? So we suffer alone and we don't seek out people to talk to. We don't seek out people to lean on. And, that usually leads to alcohol, drugs, pornography, other numbing agents, suicide. And, something you talked about that I thought was powerful, and you leaned a little on the writing of Jordan Peterson on this one, was the concept of faith and how faith can help overcome some of that isolation of men, if you will. Do you want to tackle that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I read, it was a few years ago, I read Peterson's like massive work. It's called Maps of Meaning.
Maps of Meaning.
It's like a textbook. It's sort of one of those things where I was like, I feel like I need to read it. I've read some of his other content and he's obviously like so profound and well thought out and whatnot. But I don't know, sort of dove into it. And he talks about in that book that, in the value hierarchy of society, when we lose faith, when faith, becomes devalued on that hierarchy, it leads to existential angst and depression and all sorts of things like that. If we go back to not the beginning of the conversation, but somewhere, maybe 30, 40 minutes ago, we're talking about, Beck's cognitive triad. And we say, okay, if you have negative and pervasive beliefs about yourself, the world, and the future, you're more likely to be depressed, or, it's almost inevitable that you will face depression at some point. If we then bring in the concept of faith and we sort of put the two at odds, we look at it and we say, well, if I have negative beliefs about myself, the world, and the future, and my future, then I don't really have faith in any of those things, right? There is no reason to get out of bed in the morning. There's nothing propelling me forward in the future because it's like, well, if everything's going to be terrible, then what is the point, right? But when we have faith, both on a, sort of existential level, and then also like the day-to-day level of like, things in my life can get better. My job could improve. I could get a different job. Whatever specific thing that we are battling with, whether it's, thoughts, beliefs, or a specific event or category in our life, when we have faith around those things, right, that faith propels us. It keeps us going. It's a little bit hard for me to compare that necessarily to men into isolation and whatnot. But I think in general that, like, if you think about it, right, it's like going back to that comparison to Beck. It's like, okay, if all your beliefs in those categories are negative and pervasive, then you don't have faith. But if you do have faith, then it's pretty likely that you're going to look at yourself, the world, in the future and say, look, I believe that things will get better. They can get better. And so it's an important tool to have, right? It's like we also go back and we look at, those two words we were talking about earlier, helplessness and hopelessness, and we oppose that with faith. And it's like, those really are opposing words, opposing definitions. It's like, if you're hopeless, you can't have faith if you're hopeless, at least in my mind, right? So it's like counteracting that sense of hopelessness, which is almost the manifestation of depression. It's like when we pick our faith back up, again, whether it's, on the religious level or spiritual level, or even just in specific avenues of our life, I think it helps us, become a little bit more positive, excited, more likely to get out of bed and pursue things every day. So yeah, it's definitely a critical tool. It's like, if you don't have it, it's, oh man, it can be a long road.
If I think on the religious level, I may be saying to myself, hey, God has a plan for me, right? So today may not be great, tomorrow may not be great, but God has a plan, and I'm going to believe in it, and I'm going to get up and I'm going to do my thing, and we'll see where this ends up. On the spiritual level, you may just, Zen in the art of happiness. You may just say, everything that happens for the best possible reason. And I'm just going to keep going. And whatever happens for the best possible reason. And when you're doing that, you're reframing it and saying, hey, it's not hopeless. It's not helpless. There's something down the road. I don't know what it is, but I'm going to keep going. I'm going to keep living. I'm going to keep getting out of bed.
Yeah, absolutely. And I do want to dive into this like a little bit more. It's kind of, I don't know what the right word is. It's definitely a heavier subject, but like, I feel like if we don't talk about it, it sort of does listeners a disservice, right? I think there is, as we get, what I was sort of talking about in this specific chapter that we're alluding to, right, is like, so when I talk about faith, there are definitely movements out there where it's like the world, or at least the US in general, is becoming a bit less religious. And I'm not casting judgment in this conversation. I'm just saying, like, hey, take a look at your life and the thoughts that you're thinking and the beliefs that you have, and see how they affect your mental health one way or another, right? And so we have a lot of folks, and like, don't get me wrong, like, I question my faith too. I am putting my hand up. It's a difficult thing, right? But I know that if I sink into despair and say, like, hey, everything's meaningless, everything's hopeless, like, that is no good. That is no place to be, right? Both mentally, spiritually, physically, emotionally, all those things. And so we have a lot of, like, again, not casting judgment, just kind of stating how things are. But it's like we have a lot of folks in the world. There's like, nihilistic movements. And, the more that we go into science, we say like, oh, we're just bags of cells floating around in some random universe or whatever. If you believe that, like, good luck getting out of bed in the morning. That is a brutal place to be. And I think whether or not you believe in a religion or a God or something like that, you have to believe that, like, you are here for some reason, for some purpose, that there is an explanation to all of it, even if we don't know what it is, even if we don't understand, what the meaning is or anything like that. But holding on to the, some sort of faith, even if it's in some nebulous thing, to be able to say, like, look, I don't understand what it is, but I'm not going to lose my faith just because I don't know what it is. I'm going to, continue to believe in, again, some of the things you talked about, Clint. It's like, believe in God, God's plan, believe in the universe, believe in Zen, believe in happiness, whatever it is, like having something that you can come back to each day to remind yourself and fight off the nihilism, right? Because there's a lot of folks out there that are like, well, why do anything? Like, life is meaningless and there's no reason to exist. I think if you go down that rabbit hole, it's like, it's very easy to see how folks fall into suicide at that point. I think, am I making sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And you highlighted something not just faith-based, but, and this is huge for me, is you talked about purpose. right? And one of the things, and it's apt because I use this quote a lot, and you used the concept of the ocean and ships for navigating depression. And often we'll say a man, and you can change it nowadays to a person. A person without a mission or a purpose is like a ship that's rudderless in the sea, right? And so when we don't have that purpose, when we don't have that mission, when we don't know where we're going, then we're just drifting in the ocean. And I agree with you. That is a place that leads to darkness, because why am I here? What's the point of me? What's the point of waking up? What's the point of going to work? Like there has to me, and maybe I've only realized this because I've been through it, the darkness. And you know what? Maybe it's because we think of these things, Brian. And I think that's a large part of what we're talking about today. Because I'm sure there's a lot of people that have never even thought about this concept, never even thought about the fact that, how do I think? Do I need a mission? Do I need a purpose? What am I without it? Right? So maybe that's a glorious place to be. But for those of us who do think about these things, I think you need a purpose. You need something on that horizon that says, that's where I'm going. Now, we could contrast that with the Buddhists, and they would say you need nothing. Right? You just need to be here, right now. All that horizon, that purpose, that mission, that's the depression. Right here, right now, this moment. That's all you need.
There is absolutely something to be said for that. I mean, obviously, it's like, I am so far, like the Buddhists, like obviously it's a whole school of thought, a whole movement. Like I would be kidding myself if I said that, the conclusions that I come to and the wisdom that I find in my life and put into my writings, even comes close to some of the things that an entire school of thought, an entire culture was based around. I do think what you just mentioned is another good segue, right? Where if we think about the way that the anxious and depressed mind works, right? We tend to get stuck in these loops where we constantly ruminate on a specific question, a specific idea, something like that. I talked about in one of the chapters in the book, I believe the chapter is called Deconstructing a Gyre. I was trying to take my own experience with depression and map it to different ideas that I came across, as I was doing research. And so when I said, the anxious and depressed mind tends to get caught on a specific idea, belief, something like that, right? For me, I really got stuck on this concept of like what we were talking about, a few minutes ago of like, what is the meaning of life? Nihilism and whatnot. And I kept trying to like find answers. I kept trying to solve that question. And one thing that was like really helpful for me was I eventually came upon a book by Leo Tolstoy. It's called The Confession. Like, I don't recommend reading it just from the standpoint, like I'm not panning the book at all. I'm just saying that like, it's dark, man. Like if you don't want to go there, if your mind is not ready to go there, just don't. Like, save yourself the despair. But he went through, this existential crisis where he's like, look, man, life is meaningless. Life's a cruel joke. I should just get it over with and kill myself, right? And he eventually got to the point where he said, it almost feels as though I have to solve this question. I have to figure out what the meaning of life is. And until he put that question down and said, you know what? I'm not going to ask it anymore. I'm not even going to think about it. Instead, I'm going to jump into life. I'm going to reconnect with life itself. I'm going to throw myself into passion-filled pursuits and activities. Until he did that, or once he did that, he reported that, those scary thoughts, those beliefs, those questions sort of faded away. And so I think the reason why I wanted to segue here was like you talked about Buddhism and saying all you need is the now, right? If we think about like the concept of ruminating on, hey, what's the meaning of life? Or even ruminating about like, what's going to happen next year? We're not in the here. We're not in the now. Yeah. And we talk, I did talk about this sort of stuff in the book, a chapter on presence, but it's like, they bring up a seriously good point, the Buddhists, when it's like, if you think about, we're talking about all these different complex ideas and whatnot, and it sounds ridiculously simple, and it kind of is. But at the same time, it's really difficult to say to yourself, like, I need to get into this moment right here. Whatever fears exist, like in my mind, those are fears of the future, right? Because it's like, unless I'm in front of some scary threat right now, unless I'm in front of the devil or God or whatever, right? It's like, I can just live my life. I can throw myself into, meaningful relationships, meaningful work, and I can put those questions off for a later date. And I think with the ruminative, anxious, and depressed mind, we find that it feels just like Tolstoy. It's like, it feels as though we have to solve this question. Like, it just eats away at us. And then as soon as we let go of it, it's like, what the hell was I doing that for? Like, I don't need to solve that. Like, oh man, it's gone now. It's crazy.
Well, and one of the things that you talked about you doing, and I see a lot of people do who are nihilistic or are depressive, is just that constant like searching for negative, right? And I thought one of the best things I've done for my mental health in the last decade is I to a large extent stopped reading the news. I stopped watching the news. I stopped reading newspapers, and I started just reading books, right? So I read your book. I read a book on every guest on the show, and 40, 50 books a year. And people say, well, doesn't that lead to ignorance? And it's like, well, maybe, but I'm pretty sure there's more knowledge in the books I'm reading than paranoia that I would have in the articles that I read. And so I found it beautiful that you actually talked about you listed 4 different layers of ignorance. And I like to think I'm doing the top one, where it's a purposeful choice to avoid that area because it's negative. So in simple example, people talk to me about global warming and like, hey, don't you realize what's happening? I can barely sleep. And I say, well, no, I just do what I can. It's almost the serenity prayer. I mean, what's happening globally, I can't impact that, but I can recycle. I can buy less stuff. I can, go down the list. What can I actually do? What is in my control? And that's also stoicism, right? Is if I can't control it, why am I worried about it? Like, if we all control what we can control and focus on what's in our circle, we'll be less stressed, less anxious, less depressed, and will hopefully resolve some of these big world issues. Do you want to dive into the ignorance and kind of the segue I'm taking you around it? I'll just pass it right over to you, Brian.
A little bit. I mean, I do want to, we'll leave a few details for readers to find when they pick up the book, but I will kind of take the torch from you in the sense that I will say that ignorance is not always a bad thing. Or at the very least, a particular kind of ignorance is not always a bad thing. So you talked about climate change. I also talked about climate change in the book. We are on the same page. It's basically like, you kind of wake up, let's just say day 0, maybe you're 18, maybe you're 35, maybe you're 70, who knows? There is a point in time in your life where you don't know what climate change is, not on your radar whatsoever. That's a great place to be, except for the fact that maybe you could be contributing to climate change or some other cause, right? In a small or large way. And so depending on what that impact is, that ignorance could be good or bad. So it's like, if you, I guess, as a different example, right? It's like if you're a bad driver and you're swerving in and out of lanes and you don't even realize that you're a bad driver, but you're like causing accidents, like back on the highway, like, long after you're already gone. That's a bad kind of ignorance, right? You want to know about that because you're affecting other people in a serious way. But there are, for something like climate change where, Clinton, you said, hey, what am I going to really do? Or I can only do what I can do. Ignorance can be great there because it's like we want to get to the point where we can give ourselves permission to put those scary ideas down. We don't want to have to sit in our beds or at our desks every day and be like, oh my goodness, the planet's heating up and all this different stuff. And we just want to be able to say, look, man, I did my part. I understand what's going on. I can't do this anymore. I can't spin these thoughts, right? I have to go back to my normal life. I have to be able to engage with my friends and my family. I need to be able to show up to work every day. And so being able to give ourselves permission to be ignorant about those things is a really powerful tool in the mental health game.
So if you were to say to the listener, what are the top 2 to 3 simple tactics they can implement into their life, Brian, to help them biopsychosocially? What are you throwing at them?
It's tough, man. I mean, we've talked about a lot of things.
Yeah, we've covered a lot. Yeah.
I will say, I don't know if I can give 3, especially since we've already given a lot. But I think number 1 has got to be exercise. I mean, there's a bunch of studies out there that show that exercise can be just as beneficial in the treatment of depression, SSRIs, or antidepressant medication, some other form of it. And so, for me, I mean, I even say on some of these podcasts, like, yeah, sure, I like to work out because it helps me feel a little bit more fit, right? I feel as though I'm in better health. But I would say 90+% of it is the mental aspect. I know that if I don't work out, if I don't kind of stress myself and challenge myself, I'm not going to feel good that day. And I know that my exercise, whatever form it is one of my strongest tools in the battle, against depression, against anxiety, things like that. And so I have to do it. It's not even like, it's not even a question or an option. And I don't say that in a negative way. It's like, I sort of look forward to my exercise because I'm like, if I'm feeling a little bit off that day or whatever, I know that it'll help get me out of my head, get me back into my body. And it's a really effective tool that, as these studies show, can be just as effective as, some of the antidepressant medication. What I will say, kind of going back to the disclaimers and stuff that we talked about earlier in the show, is now just because exercise, some of these studies say, is as effective as antidepressant medication in the treatment of depression, that doesn't necessarily mean that we need to pick one or the other. The whole concept of the biopsychosocial model is that we've got these different buckets in our lives that contribute to various diseases or mental illnesses that we have. But not only do all those things influence, let's say, depression or anxiety or something, but they all work in tandem with one another, right? So it's like the traditional model, and if you think about it, it makes sense. It's like the traditional model is like, hey, go into the doctor's office, get a pill, take the pill, feel a little bit better. And then all of a sudden, it's like, because I feel a little bit better, going back to the perception cycle, it's like, maybe I take some more action in my life. Maybe I make a new friend. And then as a result of those actions that I've taken, or the supporting, I guess actions is the only word I got in my head right now, but the supporting actions in the other spheres of that biopsychosocial model, we then feel better. So it's almost like medication can be that jumping off point, that stepping stone. I think that's amazing. And so it's like, if your doctor recommends that you take medication, work with your doctor to figure out what makes sense for you and if it's helping or if it's not helping. At the same time, going back to what we talked about earlier, it's like a plan that's based solely around medication doesn't work, doesn't make sense either. It's like, okay, if we're depressed for specific reasons, and then all we do is we take these pills and we sit on our couch, do we really expect things to get any better? We need to build up all 3 of these various categories from the biopsychosocial model. So it's like, I talk about that model being sort of like it's almost like an interwoven highway system, right? Where it's like the biological affects the psychological affects the biological also affects the social, and so on and so forth. We could make all those connections, right? But it's like, if you improve one of those areas, you will in some capacity improve either one or both of the others. And so it's like, if you can then get all of them going at the same time, you stand a much better chance of maybe improving the way that you're feeling. And so, I don't know, just trying to round out the conversation on that model. But it's like, man, exercise is awesome. I love it. It's great. It's it's a really effective tool in my my mental health toolkit. But at the same time, just because it's effective doesn't mean that it's the only thing that I'm going to pick up.
100%. And so, what have we missed in our conversation today? We've covered a lot of the topic from your book. We've talked a lot about depression and ways we can deal with it with the model. What's anything you want to leave the listeners with?
I think some good things to finish with are, one, kind of another disclaimer, right? It's like, we talked about a bunch of different things on this podcast. It is possible that we didn't even touch upon something that, is depressing a certain listener, or doesn't explain somebody's certain situation right now. I want folks to take away the fact that to come from this, to leave this conversation with the takeaway of knowing that there are a lot of different ways that people can get depressed. There are also many different strategies that we can employ to maybe feel less depressed. If one of those strategies or multiple of those strategies are not necessarily working for you, or maybe it feels as though we're sort of I don't know what the right word is, sort of downplaying something that you're going through. Like, that is definitely not the purpose here, right? It's like, look, I'll be totally honest. It's like if somebody's listening and they're like, look, I lost somebody who was super close to me. They'll never be back in my life. I'm so depressed because of it. It's like, the only thing I have to tell that person is like, look, man, hold on. I love you. And like, it's going to get better. I can't promise you that it's going to be as a result of, item A, B, C, or D. All I can say is that like, I've been in that dark pit before. I'll probably be back in there. I mean, I'll tell you that much, but it's like, just hold on, like hold on to your hope, hold on to your faith. It can get better. It often does. And maybe you're going through something that Clint or I have no idea what it is, right? We have no experience with that thing. I think I would just say, both of us, like our hearts go out to you. We love you, and like, just hold on and be hopeful.
Yeah, I think it's beautiful how you even say throughout the book, and we always talk about this, you and I, and people who talk about mental health, it's not the suffering Olympics. Like, we're not here to say our suffering was more than your suffering or is different. Everyone's suffering is their suffering, and Brian nailed it. If whatever you're going through, wherever you are, whoever you are, our heart goes out to you, and we wish you all the best. And all we want to be able to do when we have these conversations is, Brian does a lot of research and a lot of work in reading it. It's what are those things that are available to us that we can do in our daily lives to give ourselves that fighting chance, right? I've personally been on medication now for 18 years. And so I'm never going to tell someone not to go on medication. And I'm going to say, yeah, the medication isn't enough, because you nailed it, Brian. If I take the medication and I go lay on the couch and have beer and watch Netflix, I'm going to be depressed even on the medication. But if the medication gives me the energy to get in the gym, to get outside, to walk my dog, to talk to my kids, to be part of a group, to have conversations with friends, with family, then I've got a fighting chance. And that's all we're trying to provide people is that opportunity to have a fighting chance so that they can get out the other side of where they're at.
Yeah, very well said. I don't think I can add anything to that. It's exactly the sentiment.
All right, brother. Thank you for joining me for round 2 of Get Out of Your Head on the Pursuit of Learning podcast. Really appreciate you joining me today.
Yeah, thanks, Clint. It was a great conversation. We went deep, we went wide. I hope folks can take some good things away from it.
Thank you for joining us on the Pursuit of Learning. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and head over to our website, thepursuitoflearning.com, where you will find our show notes, transcripts, and more. If you like what you see, sign up for our mailing list. Until next time, your host in learning, Clint Murphy.